Welcome to Effective Cannabis Conversations, where certified cannabis health coaches, educators, medical professionals, scientists, pharmacists, and patients come to share their knowledge and experiences to educate on the health benefits of medicinal cannabis. Today, we will be diving into medical cannabis advocacy and stigma. And joining me for our conversation today is my friend, colleague, and an ECN advocate, Alex Mitchell. If you want to be notified of new conversations, take a few minutes to subscribe and hit the bell icon so we can keep you updated. Debi Wimberley, the founder of the Effective Cannabis newsletter. And today I'm very excited that I get to sit down and have a conversation with Alex Mitchell, who is our ECN guest editor this month. And we're going to be talking about stigma and advocacy and how it has impacting the industry, each of us individually, and how we move forward as businesses, but most importantly, what patients should know or individuals should know that are wanting to use cannabis and how they can get through stigma and how they can advocate for themselves. So thank you, Alex, for being here. And would you like to take a few minutes to introduce yourself and explain a little bit about why you wanted to become an ECN guest editor?
Thanks so much for inviting me on today, Debbie, to give me an opportunity to really talk about something that's close to my heart. So when I heard that this issue was going to be stigma and advocacy, I knew that it was where I needed to be for being a guest editor. So it is close to my heart. You can tell from my name on the screen that I do hypnosis and coaching. And hypnosis has been amazing for me. And in the process of learning about it, I learned a lot more about how people can have unconscious bias, how stigma can arise, things like that. And so I wanted to come in and have the opportunity to talk with you and share some of the learnings that I have around what happens for people. So even as a medical cannabis patient myself, and I think this is a question you're potentially going to ask me later, but I'm going for it now, I experience stigma. And I'm a cannabis coach. And I'm a medical patient, and I still experience it too. So I wanted to come on, have an opportunity to really share with people on how they can start to notice what's happening with them as they think about cannabis. And if you're brand new to cannabis, just taking an opportunity to educate people that these things may arise in you. Like, I didn't know I still had some stigma until it happened. And so I'll tell the story about that a little later on in the interview, I think, because you're going to ask me about it. But I just wanted to bring that up because it's really a huge part of why I wanted to be a guest editor now. I have an editorial that I've written that you'll be able to read that Debbie will link to in this video. Yeah, and I just want people to understand what cannabis is and how valuable it is as a medical patient. So I am a hypnotist and a life coach. I also certified as a cannabis coach because plant medicine is so important to me. And I just bring into my world as much as I can about plant medicine. And notice that I'm using that term plant medicine. That's because there is stigma out there. And for this video to even say the word cannabis might get it tagged. We don't know, right? Because there's so much stigma out there, and advocacy is such a need for all of us. Because I know that cannabis can help so many people. I've watched how it's helped myself. I've watched how it's helped my family. I watched how it's helped my friends like Debbie, who has an incredible story about her journey with cannabis, if you haven't heard it yet. So I'm just part of, I want to be part of this. And I knew that this was the right place for me.
Thanks, Alex. I appreciate that. That means a lot. As we're winding up 2023, talking about stigma and advocacy in cannabis is so important and necessary to understand the current challenges and how we can advocate for medical cannabis. So today we're going to break this conversation into a few segments. And our first segment is going to be personal experience and growth. So when you first approached the idea of utilizing medical cannabis, did you have to overcome stigma? And if yes, how did you overcome the stigma?
You know, my story is an interesting one, Debbie, because I came to cannabis really late in life. And at first it was recreational, I will say. It became legal in the state of Washington. I thought, well, let me see what this is about. Gave it a try and was like, okay, wow, this is interesting. And I tried cannabis a few times, you know, in the past when I was younger, but I was, let's do the math. I think I was 47 when I started really focusing in on cannabis as something that could be a relaxation tool for me, right? So we grow up being socialized in our country, sometimes worldwide, depending on where you live, about how, you know, people use alcohol or they drink alcohol or a glass of wine to relax at the end of the day. And what I knew about myself is in getting older that I didn't feel good after I did that. I still wanted that relaxation, but having a glass of wine or 2 glasses of wine, my liver didn't like it. And when I discovered cannabis, it really helped. And so I began to replace alcohol with cannabis in a recreational manner. And then the pandemic happened, as we all remember. And there was that time in 2020 when everything changed. And I lost my job at the beginning of the pandemic. And because I was homeschooling a second grader, I had 2 new dogs, one of which was a puppy, and I'd lost my job. I was just like doing everything I could. And what I noticed was I continued to consume cannabis and maybe expanded a little bit of what I was consuming because I didn't have a day job anymore. And I thought, wait a second, how are all these things happening in the world? The world, to me personally, to my family, and yet I feel better than I felt before the pandemic. And as I continued to explore that, I realized that cannabis was the part that was missing. And that led me to a search of beginning to explore, well, what is cannabis and what can it do for me from a medical standpoint? Because at the time I was on antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications. And I'm not advocating for anyone to do anything that is against their doctor's advice. But this is my personal story and the way that I took this journey. And I honestly didn't want to be on antidepressants any longer. They changed how I felt. I didn't feel like me. They honestly did things like even changing how you experience some parts of pleasure, right? So when we think about eating something delicious, our salivary glands start working. And on it, antidepressants, mine actually stopped working. And so it was really a surprise to me as I began that transition with the approval of my therapist and working with my doctor to come off of my medications. It was a real surprise when those came back and you realize, oh, this is how much this has blocked how I've been feeling. And so I did a very careful come off of my medications and then did a medical cannabis consultation at a local dispensary that focused on medical patients, had a little talk with them, learned a lot more, found the Cannabis Coaching Institute, studied more. And there, during that program, with the help of several cannabis coaches, I began to really hone in on what really worked for me. So I won't say that my journey was absolutely, you know, roadblock free or rough road free, coming off of medication onto cannabis as what I use to help my endocannabinoid system be balanced so that I don't have depression and anxiety. There were some ups and downs, but they weren't unmanageable. And I just kept working with it because once I found the right dosage for me and the right combination of cannabinoids and the routine of getting into that and how I consumed it and how I made my own medicine, it just opened up everything. And then that led me to where I am now with studying hypnosis, integrative change work, really looking at, you know, what can we do? Because there are a lot of things that cannabis can do for us in helping us balance our endocannabinoid system. But my personal view is there's even more beyond that. And I think if I didn't have this nice solid base that my use of medical cannabis gives me, I wouldn't be able to do the work that I do now. I wouldn't have been able to have the personal growth that I've had. My therapist wouldn't have said to me, I don't know what you're doing in that program, but whatever you're doing, keep it up. And I said, I'm doing really well, aren't I? And she said, you are. And we have a 20 plus year relationship. So I can ask this kind of question and she can say this kind of thing to me. I said, did you ever think I would get here? And she said, honestly, no. She said, where you were wasn't bad. But what you're doing now and the work that you're doing now is just really taking you to new places. And I want to tell you that I support you and I'm proud of you. So that was really great for me to hear. But internally, I know that part of the reason I've been able to make these strides is that I have worked with my ECS to get it back in balance. I won't say it's 100% balanced, but I continue to consume my medical cannabis in whatever form my body is telling me I need that day. And I'm doing great. So I want everyone to learn that this kind of thing can happen. Doesn't mean that there's not a place for medical antidepressants. Doesn't mean that they aren't appropriate for some people. It doesn't mean that everybody's going to come off of their medication and use cannabis in this way. It's all an exploration and a journey that we have to go on to see whether this works for us. And I think that having a cannabis coach and having the ability to explore and trust yourself and start to learn how this works makes all the difference for people, for me at least.
Thanks, Alex. You dropped a whole lot of good stuff there. And one of the things I'd like to know, you said it was at age 47 that you came to understand a little bit about cannabis and including it. So I'm pretty sure you grew up through the period that I did of just say, no, don't use cannabis. It's hard on you. It's bad for you. There's nothing good about it. So did you have to really approach your family and your doctors and everybody in a specific way to even go down this road? Because I think that's one of the things that's the hardest for most of us, is being able to have those conversations and feel comfortable about approaching those.
Yeah, Debbie, it was hard. And it wasn't, at that moment, it wasn't necessarily internal stigma that I was feeling. It was fear of what others might think. And that first time that I revealed to my husband, hey, I'm trying this, and here's what it, from a recreational standpoint, like you and I, he grew up during that time too, and again, this speaks to that priming that happens to us here in the United States and perhaps other places where we have these things put in front of us constantly. We're on drugs, right? This is your brain on drugs, the broken egg in the frying pan. All of those images are ways that we've been primed, where we've been told this is bad, this is bad, this is bad, this is bad for you, don't do this. Well, of course, we would start to feel, oh, this is bad. Many of us heard that over and over while we were growing up. I'll speak to myself, I won't say we. I definitely had some unconscious biases toward people who consumed cannabis, right? I didn't really know what it was. So, of course, we've all experienced that stigma, right? Because we were primed to do it. If we had been educated over and over and over that cannabis was good as a medicine, that it was right for us, imagine how we would be now, right? And so having that conversation with my husband was pretty easy because it was recreational at that point. Having the conversation with my therapist about, hey, this is what I'm doing and I want to let you know. It's legal in Washington, remember, so I'm not feeling any of the issues that someone might feel if they live in a state where it's not legal. Of course, we know on a federal level here now, November 20th, 2023, still not legal on a federal level here in the United States, unlike our neighbors to the north, Canada. And And so I think that made it a little easier for me because it was legal. And I think that legality itself decreases some of the stigma that's associated with it. And so I applaud those states who are continuing to move forward for legalization. I think Ohio was our latest. But then, talking to my therapist about it was easy because it was legal. But then the doctor was another story. And I'll just be honest, you guys, when I talked to the doctor about coming off of the antidepressants and anti-anxiety meds, I didn't tell her I was using cannabis because I knew there was a stigma associated with it. I had told my therapist, though I want to be really clear that my therapist was very aware. And my therapist, I think, did the right thing. She said to me, because I actually brought this up in January, and she said, I totally support you in this, but could you wait 3 months until the sun comes back? It's very dark here in Seattle during the winter. And she was right? She's like, it's not the time to make a switch when we're still in this darkness, because we know, she and I know, that seasonal affective disorder is part of what happens to me. I use a light box every day during the winter. I'm not from Seattle, so I didn't grow up with this. So I was used to more sunshine. So I didn't tell my doctor. I told my doctor had me take, one of those little tests that you do, those written tests that they have you do. And I was scoring okay on it because I was consuming cannabis at that point. I was still on my antidepressants as well. And I told my doctor, hey, my therapist is on board with this. My therapist, we have a very solid relationship. She's going to make sure that this goes well. And my doctor said, okay, totally agree with you. You can do this. Again, not knowing that I was using cannabis. And she said, do you want to come off of it quickly or you want to come off of it slowly? And I said, I want you to make the recommendation for the best way for me to come off. And she said, okay, I think you should do it slowly. I'm like, great, let's do that. And so I did. I did a slow titrate down of that, right? Consuming my cannabis. And that was actually before I knew about multi-cannabinoid mixtures. I only knew about THC at that point. So I was only using THC. And so that's when I say it wasn't a smooth road to come off of it. I didn't know enough. And so luckily, I ended up in the Cannabis Coaching Institute right after that, because I was like, if cannabis is doing this much for me, like, what more could I do? And somehow I stumbled upon this training program and I thought, okay, I don't have a job right now. This seems like this would be great. And so what I know now is that I took that course because I really needed to be educated. And now I see it's actually part of that stepping stone to the work that I do now, because I want to educate, even in my own community. Let's think about the community of hypnotists that I belong to, and change workers and life coaches. I've done so much education about cannabis so far with them, just by showing up, talking about it, being open, telling people you can ask me questions. I've been to conferences where people say, what do you do? I tell them and I say, and I'm a cannabis coach. And it immediately gets their interest because people want to know. They want to know what this is. They're hearing about it. They know that it can do amazing things. Then maybe they've heard a story that of a cancer patient who used it and had miraculous things happen. Maybe their friend has told them, hey, it helps me sleep better. And so people are curious. And I want to take that to a larger platform. Hence, when this came up, I'm like, this is for me, because this is that next step to how do I spread the word even more? How do I be even a more effective advocate than I am already? So I have goals, right? I have dreams. I've applied to speak at HypnoThoughts Live in 2024, which is the largest hypnosis conference in the world. It's in Las Vegas. And I've applied to speak about cannabis and why people need to understand what it is, so that when they're faced with a client on the other side of their screen or sitting across from them in their office, they'll understand when someone says, I consume cannabis. Because they don't, right now, people don't understand unless they have a personal relationship with it through themselves or through another person that they're close to. They really don't understand what is possible with cannabis as a medicine. And so that is my mission right now, is to, how can I get this? How can I share more about this on a larger stage? Because the more people we can educate, and turn into advocates, the better off we'll all be.
You said some pretty powerful points there, and I want to hit on a couple of them. I loved when you said if we'd been educating over and over on this plant, we would be at a different space right now. And I'd like to add a little bit to that. I believe if we had that knowledge, we would be a healthier world and a healthier space than what we are today. Time to make a switch. I think that's really critical when we're making decisions and we're advocating for our own health and making sure that we are approaching it in a mindful manner in what we're going to do. You don't just say, oh, I'm going to stop this today and stop this today. You know, stigma is an issue for each one of us, and advocacy is an issue for each one of us. We're advocating for everyone, but we also have to always learn to advocate for ourselves, because when we advocate for ourselves, it helps us advocate for other people. So I think that that was a really powerful point there to understand when is it time to switch and how do you do it and how do you maneuver it.
I'd like to add something there, Debbie, actually, in response to that, because there's a part of my story that I just realized I didn't finish, which is that advocacy piece. So coming off of those medications, right? I did it. I was working with cannabis, continued through that with my therapist all along, ended up in a really stable situation once I figured out which cannabinoids I needed to take and in what ratios. I went back to my doctor a year later, as one does, for that annual checkup. And what was I handed? An anxiety and depression scale to fill out. And so I did. Filled it out, boom, 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 boom. Everything looked great. Doctor comes in. She's like, wow, you're doing so great. I was looking back at your previous questionnaires that we'd done, and wow, you're just doing so great. And I said, I am. Can I tell you about what I did? And she's like, sure. And so then I launched into that story about cannabis. And at the end, I pulled out of my bag a book that I thought that she would respond to. Because if I don't advocate and try to educate, then the next person who comes in, she might not understand either. I said, it's a book. It's a book written by a doctor about medical cannabis. And so I handed her Bonnie Goldstein's book. I just thought, why not? Why not? And so she said, thank you. She said, I'll read it. And she said, and I'll add it into the bookshelf here at work where we all share books. It's all I could do, right? Did she ever read it? I have no idea. But if you don't take that step and actually make that offer to people, how will we ever get this word out? And so I started with my doctor by just educating her, because I want her to understand when someone comes in and they put down that they're consuming cannabis, that it is not necessarily they're a pothead, they're a stoner. And in fact, I now don't list cannabis, right? They try to get you to list it under drugs. No, I now list it under supplements when I'm answering questionnaires at doctors' offices. Because for me, it is a supplement. It's a supplement just like I take my vitamin D every day here in the Pacific Northwest. I take my cannabis every day.
Thanks, Alex. That's, again, you put in a bunch of good nuggets in that one as well. And I just want to add into this about you saying this is a supplement for you. This is actually a medicine for me.
Yes.
Because of what I use it for. So, you know, I think we have to be honest with our doctors when we talk about this. And I just had an incident that happened for me in a hospital stay. Now I have a list pretty long of serious health conditions. And I found myself going into a hospital for the first time after almost 8 years. And I have eliminated 28 pharmaceuticals, and nobody's documenting that what I'm replacing those with, which it should be documented how I'm doing that, but they don't want to accept in general that I'm using cannabis to replace all these pharmaceuticals. And so I found myself up against a wall trying to fight for oxygen, which I need when I'm up, when I sleep, and if I'm up moving around because of my lung health. And then they were like, why aren't you taking pharmaceuticals for all of these medical conditions? It doesn't make sense. The list of medical conditions that I have, COPD, MAC lung disease, why aren't you taking pharmaceuticals? Well, I use medical cannabis for this. And then it kind of oh, okay. But then they don't take you as seriously. And so
Mm.
we have to work and advocate to change that, because that is my medicine. And I found myself in the hospital without access to my medicine. And then that sets me back and takes me a while to recover. And then they just want to put on more pharmaceuticals and reintroduce you to those. And I'm like, no, I'm not starting those again. I worked too hard to get off of them. So, it's just really something that we really have to be mindful about when we talk about this, for advocating for yourself. My husband actually said, well, let's just not tell them this. Let's just don't tell them that you use medical cannabis, because we kind of know what the response is going to be. And it's like, that's not acceptable for me. If I'm going to do this and fight for this every day for myself, I need to fight for everyone to have a voice. So this is really something that's really critical and that we need to be able to talk about.
I
So I
think that's
think,
a great point, Debbie, because, and thank you for reframing that for me, because I think my switch that I need to make, again, this is why we educate and why we have conversations, because you just sparked off something in me where I was like, I refuse to put this under the recreational drugs portion of this questionnaire. So I'm putting it in supplements, right? But you're right, where I list my thyroid med, I should be listing my medical cannabis, because I do use it for very specific medical reasons, not lung disease like you have, but for depression, right? That's a valid use of it. And, PTSD, right? When you look at my medical card, I have PTSD. I've been diagnosed, right? And so that's why I have a medical card, because it helps with it so much. So you're right. And it encourages me that the next time I have to answer one of those, to just boldly list it right there with my thyroid meds and have that conversation.
we need to know what people are using cannabis for. But I think that it's really important that we start labeling it exactly what it is for us, because yes, it could be a supplement for some people. But I think just dealing with sleep, it's medicine. People give you medicines, pharmaceuticals to go to sleep. So now we're changing that and people are using cannabis to sleep. I think this is a really important question that we address is, are you open with your son? And how do you discuss this topic? Because I think that so many moms are terrified, or dads are terrified to talk to their kids about this and how to approach that. Because if your kids talk about it in the wrong atmosphere, maybe, then you will be coming and be investigated. No parent should ever have to be suffering through losing a kid because they're using cannabis as a medicine.
It really actually wasn't until I went through my training at the Cannabis Coaching Institute that I had the words to be able to talk to him about it, right? And I think that was really important for me. So any parents who are thinking about how do I talk to my child about this, there are lots of resources out there done by some really great cannabis advocates that you can find. But for me personally, I try to normalize it, right? So my child definitely had seen me drinking wine and beer. And so I try to normalize it. Those things seem normal in our society. And what I know now is that alcohol doesn't serve my body well. I don't do well with that. It's something I don't want to consume anymore. And so I normalize sort of that it exists, that it is a medicine, that it has a real name. It's called cannabis. And I've just sort of made it part of what I talk to him about. I tell him it's for adults. If you have questions, you can ask me. He's asked me a few questions, like, well, what happens if you smoke a joint? Isn't that bad? Isn't smoking bad? And I say, well, actually, yes, smoking cigarettes is very bad. Smoking cannabis is a little different. And some days that's the way I need to consume my medicine with cannabis. And I explained to him, molecules in smoke are different than the ones that I take when I put it in my mouth. My body accepts them and uses them in different ways. Some days that's what I need. Some days I can use a vape, a dryer vaporizer. always I have that foundation of the cannabis tincture that I take every day. And so he's aware of it. I make medicine in our kitchen. I grow cannabis at home because I'm a medical patient. I can do that here in Washington State. Yeah, I just normalize it and I make it part of what we do. It's just part of what I do for my health, and he knows that. I told him it's not for kids. He's totally okay with that. I don't know where I'm going to go with it with him as a teen. He's 12 years old now. He just turned 12. Has a few questions. I did have to explain what stigma was to him. He didn't know what that meant. So explain that to him. Yeah, I think normalization is the piece for me of like, it is normal to have a plant that grows in the wild, just like lavender, just like rosemary, just like anything, right? It's a plant.
It is.
I can take a lavender spray and put it on my pillow to help me sleep. I can also take a cannabis edible to help me sleep through the night. It's a plant.
I think it's interesting because it is a plant, and we tell everybody on a regular basis they need to consume their vegetables and their fruits. And does that interact with our endocannabinoid system? Yes, there are some terpenes in there that do. Well, so does the cannabis plant. I think it was really nice that you say we need to normalize it, because I think that, and that's what I do. What do we do, or how do we talk to our kids when we go to the farm? They drive with us to the pharmacy as we're picking up a prescription. We bring it home, we take it out of whatever container, and we consume it. Is there any conversation that happens around that? No, we just do it. Kids just accept that that's something. If they do have questions, we explain it to them. And I think this is really critical and important advice that we give, that, you know, we need to normalize this. This kind of goes back to you talking about educating over and over and over. They're going to keep coming back to that, because how many of us have had to have conversations with our kids about alcohol or cigarettes, and you're not old enough to use it? That's the same thing you do with cannabis. You have to be 18. And some states it's 21 to consume cannabis. So it's the same thing, but it's a difference because cannabis actually can be a benefit, where I haven't found any benefit from cigarettes or alcohol. So I think that's really beautiful that that's the way you communicate with your son, and that I think that's good advice. So thank you. Can you share any personal experiences or stories that highlight the positive impact of medical cannabis on individuals' health and well-being?
Well, you know, that's a question for me like that. That's a big question, because of course I have, you know, friends who have used medical cannabis to treat their cancer and are cancer free. And so that's probably my biggest win of when I think of stories. But also people who, you know, are having trouble sleeping and they take it. And you know, sleep is so vitally important. We can't have any health without sleep. And if medical cannabis helps you sleep at night, that's just going to benefit everybody in your life, because a well-rested person is going to come to their life and show up in their life in a much different way than someone who is sleep deprived. So there's definitely been that. I've had folks who have used cannabis to help with digestive issues that they have that I'm aware of. I have friends who have fibromyalgia who use cannabis to be able to move through their lives pain-free. I mean, probably the most important story in my life is actually your story, Debi, because Debi's story, again, I'm like, go watch Debi's story, because Debi's story is amazing. It's amazing what it's been able to change in her life because of medical cannabis.
Thank you so much, Alex, for sharing that. My story to me is just my story. I don't ever think of it as being something that huge, but I appreciate when people give me the acknowledgement and the credit for what work I've done. And it's why I do what I do now in the Effective Cannabis newsletter and everything else, because these stories are so powerful and so important, and people need to understand that these kind of advancements are actually being made in health. I just learned how to use it correctly and put in the time and effort. And, it's an ongoing journey. This is the one thing I will say, it's non-stop. Because of the health issues that I have, I will always be taking medical cannabis. It will always be a part of my life. It's not one of those things you can take for 3 weeks and everything fixes. That's not true. I think it's important to understand your ECS and the role that it plays. So thank you for sharing that. So now we're going to move on to perception and awareness. How would you describe the current public perception of medical cannabis? And what factors contribute to it?
Well, that's an interesting question, Debbie, because you have a very interesting word in there, right? What's the perception of medical cannabis? And I think the perception of medical cannabis is actually vastly improved. Medical. Note that I'm saying medical cannabis because, let's be honest, congrats to Netflix for backing and showing all of these documentaries about cannabis and the amazing things that can happen when people use it mindfully and consume it mindfully for a specific medical purpose. And so I think when we talk about, what is the perception of medical cannabis, it's definitely improved over where it was. I think there is still a lot of stigma out there with our doctors. I hear stories, I heard a story, 6 months ago of an incident that happened in Michigan where, I just want to say this to everybody and hear this. In the United States, other than a few places, CBD is 100% legal, 100% legal at a federal level. And in Michigan, I heard this story from a friend of a patient who consumed legal CBD. Again, I'm stressing the legal on a federal level CBD, and yet was told by a doctor in Michigan, if you don't stop taking that, I'm not going to provide you medical services. And this is in a small town in rural Michigan. It's the only doctor. Wow. Did he bring his stigma and bias into the treatment room? CBD is legal on a federal level here in the United States. So I think, obviously we have a long way to go with a whole lot of doctors who are not educated on what an ECS even is. It's not in the curriculum in medical school. It's been known for 30 plus years, yet still doctors being trained today are not taught about it. And that to me is a serious injustice to all of our health. Because if a doctor doesn't understand what an ECS is and how it works, they're just kind of shooting blindly. I think there's a long way to go with the medical field. And so it encourages me to see doctors start to show up, start to be pioneers in this area. And we must acknowledge that Bonnie Goldstein and Dustin Sulak have done so much to move this conversation forward on the medical side. And I will always be supportive of them because they are out there risking their livelihoods to come out and talk about this and try to educate people. And I think the more that we can do to start to educate, because to walk into my doctor's office with the knowledge that I did made what I said so much better, right? Because I knew I was coming from a very solid background. I knew what I was talking about. I was able to educate her a little. I've educated my therapist, right? I've educated, my naturopath. It's like it just goes on and on about who we educate and how we start to do that. And as we educate, that perception is going to change of medical cannabis. But if we don't speak up as medical patients, we are the change. We have to take the steps. If we don't take the steps, who's going to do it?
You made again. You just keep dropping a lot of good points here, and I'm going to follow up on a couple of those. First off, I think that you and I both went to learn and study cannabis to improve our own health. And with that led us to where we are now. And so I think it's important for everybody to understand the value of them understanding how their ECS works, because it's individual to them. Every one of us have an ECS, and it's very different for every one of us. Taking the time to educate yourself is really important because it's your health. No one else lives it but you. Having a coach or an educator that you can partner with and understand and ask questions. And I just want you to leave you with this thought. What if we didn't understand or learn that we had a cardiovascular or respiratory system until the 1990s, and it was still not taught in medical schools, and we were not given access to something that could improve it? Where would our health system be today with cardiovascular and lung conditions being the number one and two that cause death in the United States and worldwide? We have to bring this to the table because your ECS should be a part of any treatment plan that you have. It should not be left out, just like your cardiovascular and the respiratory system.
Totally agree. And I just have to say this part too, Debbie. Like, let's like back way up and just look at this plant and go, wow, this plant evolved to match what we create inside our own bodies. This plant evolved to do that. It's not that we evolved for the plant evolved for us. And that's amazing, because to know that those cannabis molecules look so similar to things that we create inside our own systems, it's just amazing. Just amazing.
And it's amazing from the point that it knows how to attach to the receptors that we produce in our body, and it knows how to work. Because if you take my health issue, we'll talk about chronic pain for a minute. And when I developed chronic regional pain syndrome, it was such an intense firing of electrical shocks that kept running through my body, and my ECS could not keep up. So it eventually says, okay, I have to take care of your heart, I have to take care of your lungs, I have to address all these other body systems because it keeps your body in harmony. And so it's like, I can't address this, so I'm just going to ignore it. And that's what happened to me for 3 decades. It was being ignored by my doctors. Yeah, we were providing pharmaceuticals, but I mean, it was just blocking that receptor. It wasn't addressing it, it was just blocking it. And when I introduced cannabis to my health, it was unbelievable how it reacted with my receptors. And I went from living in a pain of 10 to a pain of 3. And that is something that I was told would never happen. It was not possible. And I'm not on any pain medication at all. I just use cannabis. So, I think that it's really important that you brought that out. And we often, as educators and coaches, sometimes forget to bring these points to the front because we live this and breathe this and talk this all day. And there's just so many people that are just learning about this and are gravitating to it. So education is important, and that's part of why we do the newsletter as well, is to make sure that we're providing you with information that can help you make decisions, connect with the right people, and understand what you need to do for your health. Because again, I'm going to continue to say it, it's your health, nobody else's. So let's move on to stigma challenges. What do you believe are the common misconceptions about stigma associated with medical cannabis? And why does it still exist?
Well, I think the common misconceptions are, oh, they're a stoner, they're a pothead, right? That's the major one, right? Because often, like when I think about these times that I've been out at conferences or whatever, I don't look like what people think a stoner is or a pothead, right? And that's that misconception that a lot of people have, that they don't understand the true power of cannabis and the way that it affects my health. And so I think that is our biggest piece to overcome, is to start, again, I'm going back to normalizing that this is a plant medicine. I take my vitamin D so I don't have seasonal affective disorder. I take my cannabis so I don't have depression. It's the same thing. And I think that normalization of it is the way forward. And I think that is the biggest thing that we face. Again, it's that lack of education that people don't understand. They don't know what cannabis is because it's been hidden from us for all those years. And when we go back and we, it's going to drift into a part of the conversation that, it is what it is, right? We know that this medicine was taken away from us because of racism and the patriarchy and all these things, right? And we're all suffering for it because we don't know about this medicine. It was taken away, right? It used to be prescribed by doctors.
Well, and I think you bring up some really valid points here, and it's exactly where I live, is that, I don't think anybody that ever meets me would say I'm a stoner or I'm high. I'm always medicated. I medicate 3 to 4 times a day, but I do what's called microdosing. I know how much to take and how much to put into my body to manage it safely. We spent a good proportion of my life stigmatizing this plant and making it known to be bad. But if you go back and look way back in history, it's been prescribed as medicine for a long time. So, we're trying to now flip this back around and get it back to where it is acceptable and treating as a medicine. And this happens by you and I sitting here and having this conversation and showing I'm no different than someone that takes pharmaceuticals. There's no difference. So I do think this is our biggest hurdle to come across. And let's talk about patient empowerment for just a moment. So how can patients become advocates for their own health, particularly when considering medical cannabis as a potential treatment? So it's more than just deciding to use it. This is now becoming a medical treatment. So how can we help someone understand and become empowered in that?
That's an interesting question, because at the end of the day, you have to be, as you've said, you have to be your own advocate, right? And so if you have a medical condition and you wonder, would cannabis help me with it? Starting even just searching within the Effective Cannabis newsletter article archive is a huge step, right? Because they're not only articles written, but they're also anecdotal pieces there where you're hearing from people who are just like you, perhaps living their life, telling their story about how cannabis helped them. Just like I told my story of coming off of antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications using cannabis. And so it's a great place to start. And then I honestly think educating yourself, whether that's doing Healer or that's buying a book. There are books out there that are not written by doctors that are also about the benefits of cannabis. I'm thinking about, Debbie and I have a colleague, Kim Sarson. She has a book called Midlife Magic. It's about the use of cannabis in the middle part of a woman's life. What is that like? What can it do for you? And so I think going out and starting to read and educate yourself is the number one step, right? Hiring a cannabis coach if you can afford it. It's a great first step, right? Figuring out, is there something that can be done with this? And I also think, finding, for people who have really serious medical conditions, looking for that doctor that might work with them on it. We know they're out there.
So when we're thinking about educational initiatives and how we go through this, the Effective Cannabis newsletter is designed just to do that. So what drew you to collaborate with the Effective Cannabis newsletter and become an ECN advocate, write for us, and then become a guest editor?
Debbie, it is this part about educating people. I want to get the word out. And by joining together with other people and collaborating, we can amplify those voices. If I were over here by myself, writing articles about how effective cannabis is, that's one voice in a very large, mix of things going on. And so when we band together and support each other and get the word out. That's why I joined. I am an ECN advocate because I believe so strongly in this. When I think about what are the things that I do to help move the conversation forward, well, one, I donate to Normal. I donate to Americans for Safe Access, which is a medical cannabis patient advocacy group. And I'm an ECN advocate, right? I come in, I write, I promote, I talk. Those are the things that I do. And I think that piece of education is so important. And I just do it in my daily life. I think for me, that is also key, right? I am always talking about it to whoever will listen. And I'm normalizing and I'm trying to break stigma. And speaking of stigma, there are times that when I still have it. And I'm a cannabis coach and a medical patient, but I still find myself hitting it sometimes. I did a photo of myself smoking a joint. I couldn't post it. That was my stigma coming up because I know there's actually nothing wrong with that. It is how I was receiving my medication. And yet still, despite all of my work, I still had that moment, right? I've posted it now, but when I tried to do it the first time, I felt it come up in myself. And I recognized it and I'm working with it. But that piece around educating as many people as we can about what cannabis can do for medical patients, I think is key. And if we don't get out and do the work, who's going to do it? Certainly not the pharmaceutical companies, certainly not the doctors who aren't educated on what an ECS even is. And nothing bad against those doctors. They don't know. They only know what's taught to them in medical school and what they then research and continue on with. And if they don't know that they should be looking at an ECS and learning about it, then how will they ever learn about it? Unless people like me, as a patient, show up and say, hey, do you know what an endocannabinoid system is?
I think that you made a really good point there about your own stigma showing up recently. I myself have thought I've gone through all this stigma. I don't have any stigma anymore. I'm very vocal about what I do. But then I had a health condition that started appearing, and it was in my gut. And I had to go see somebody new that knew nothing about me. There was no medical history relating to any of my cannabis use on my file. But I knew that it was going to be something that they were going to say, you need to just stop using cannabis. I knew that was not the answer. And I needed them to take me seriously. So I found myself, that was the first time I have not been open with a doctor. And I think that it really took me back, that I found myself in that space again. And I did not like where it left me. But to take care of my health and get the recognition that I needed, I had to do that. So there are times when that stigma serves you well, and you need to honor that at that moment. As hard as that was for me, I do think there are times when we still have to say, okay, this is telling me that I shouldn't go forward with this. So we'd love to knock down the barriers to this and have this all be gone away tomorrow. Mm-hmm. We have a long way to go. Mm-hmm. And we have a long way to advocate to make a change.
But see, I would argue with you, Debbie. I think this is a point that needs to be made for people. I don't think that was stigma coming out in you.
No.
I think that was common sense. I think that was your higher self going, you know what? This is not the time to open with this. Because it will open at some point with this doctor. And I think that there is, maybe there was some feeling, of like, oh, I'm going to be dismissed, which is the stigma coming out. But I think it's also, though, you being smart. It's not the time to normalize it in that first meeting with that doctor, maybe not even the second one. And so when I think about going out and talking about it, you do have to kind of read the room. It's like, I have to pick when I'm going to normalize, when I'm going to be an advocate by reading what's happening in the room. And that, I think, is our way, or my way, speaking about myself, my way of taking care of that, honestly, that inner child, right? It's like we all have these histories that we bring with us. No matter where we are, we have that past history in our life, and we know that it affects us. And to go out on a limb and, you know, and be an advocate for medical cannabis, there's a piece of me that has to take care of that inner child and make sure that it's an okay place for me to do that. And I wish that weren't the case. I wish that it were like I could be as open about it no matter what. Just like I would feel no problem telling someone I take vitamin D. But again, I have to respond to what's happening in the world. There are spaces where we can be totally open. There are spaces where we're working to normalize it. And there are spaces where we, unfortunately, still have to hold ourselves back. And that is the reality that we live in right now.
Thanks for that. And I should have probably prefaced that. That was it wasn't my stigma. I felt it was the doctor's stigma.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Right. We know that there are times when it's just like, no.
So we're going to look at the future outlook of cannabis here and where we're going. And one of the things with the Effective Cannabis newsletter is that we are vetted. And everybody that writes for the newsletter, we know that they're certified and qualified to talk about this. And I think that when we look at we were to go look at, I know for myself, I can speak for myself. When I was first starting my journey with cannabis, I was looking at Google and Twitter and all these places to find this information. I find that when we're looking for good information about cannabis to treat health conditions, we need to know that that's vetted. It's backed up by research. We have enough research now to say cannabis is medicine. There's no reason that we're not accepting that. So we are committed to providing people with quality, accurate, vetted information. The thing you need to understand, our information changes over time. We just started learning about this plant in the last 30 years. And really diving into what it's capable of doing. And so that's changed even since the 8 years that I've been doing this. There's some new information that's came out. So moving forward to the future, what would you like to see the future of cannabis become?
Well, that's a big question. That's a very big question. You know, I want to see cannabis remain the natural plant that it is and the medicine that it brings to us to stay in that natural state. I don't want it to be, it's interesting because where I'm going to with the future is lots of I don't wants. I don't want it to be taken over by big pharma. I don't want it to be taken over by, you know, companies that, you know, end up buying farms in every single state and then they homogenize it all. Because one of the beautiful things about cannabis is each plant is also unique, right? Just like our ECS is unique. I want that plant to be able to grow and flourish and be grown outside and be, you know, grown in good soil. And if it needs to be grown indoor, like it has to be in Arizona where Debi is because of the weather, that they do it in a way that keeps the plant as close to natural as possible, because that's what I want to see. I want to see this plant remain a plant and not be turned into big business.
Yeah. I'll second that. I think that's great. And that's what I want to see. You can grow your own carrots. You can grow your own apples. You can grow your own broccoli.
Yes.
Why shouldn't you be allowed to grow your own medicine if you choose to? Not everybody's going to choose to grow their own medicine, like everybody doesn't choose to grow their own vegetables and fruits. But I think having that as an option should always be on the table. We also want to make sure that doctors are moving forward with us. And that means we need to be bringing education to the students that are learning this now. So we can say, okay, doctors didn't know about this when they went through medical school. We know about this now. We need to be educating them. This is a system we are all born with, and it is being ignored. And I've had people say, well, we've never needed to utilize it before. Well, guess what? Over 50% of Americans live with at least one chronic condition, if not multiple. And those statistics were before the pandemic. So I believe that's much higher. 1 in 3 around the world, adults, live with at least one chronic condition. So what if we were educating about this and not so many people had chronic conditions? There is a chance for that if we do this right. And that education starts now. It has to start moving forward, but in the future, it should be taught in all schools, no matter what grade. Everybody needs to know the power of this and the importance of it. So thank you, Alex, for sharing your experience and how you work to advance medical cannabis in your own life and to help other people with it. It really is amazing. So is there anything that we talked about today or didn't discuss today that you would like to share? Is there just some point that I didn't hit on that you think would be important here?
You know, if you know me, and hopefully some of you will come into my sphere and start to get to know me, you will know that I am a huge dog lover. And so I have to put this point in. We're all mammals, right? My dog has an ACS too. And I took that little barky dog that we rescued, who hated everybody and everything, and every dog made him lunge and snap. And I took him to a friendly little guy who still barks because he's a Chihuahua. But now his tail wags and he wants to play with other dogs, and people don't freak him out. And the way that I did that was by first trying him on CBD. And when that didn't work, I gave him just a tiny bit of THC. Because I'm a cannabis coach and I know that actually dogs can take cannabis, including THC. You just have to be careful. And so now he is a happy little guy out there having fun, overcame his trauma of being a rescue, living on the streets of Laredo, Texas. And he's a great little guy. And so I want to just say to people, it's not just for people, it's also for your pets and your animals, and to not forget that part, because I'm a dog lover and I love to support dogs. So yeah, that would be the only piece. Normalize giving cannabis to your dogs. That's what I do. I tell everybody when I'm out walking him and they say, oh, he's so cute. And I go, oh, it's because he takes cannabis, including THC.
I love that. And I have, you know, I'm a dog lover as well. And I have 2 of my own little dogs here. Yeah. Well, we know the world is curious. Yes. We know the world wants to learn. But we also know the world has a lot of barriers to break down and to change how they feel about this plant. And that starts with each one of us and how we talk about and communicate about how we use cannabis ourselves and how we incorporate it in our daily lives, even like with our animals. So thank you for bringing that in. I appreciate that. And shout out to your dogs. And I'm glad that they're living healthy, happy lives now and wagging their tail. So thank you for tuning in and thank you for joining me. And I hope that you'll leave feedback in the chat below and let us know if there's anything that you would like to know more, and you know, connect up with a coach or an educator if you have questions. And we're always here to support. Thank you and have a good day.